Go, no go for Lockdown Part 2. Behind the biggest decision in UK history. What went on in the war room as Johnson prepared to take a giant leap for vaccine. Note to censors: we use only government data. If you have a problem with the results, speak to the government. We left Part 1 here. In fact, I stated it wrongly in closing. We do not both reach the 80% saturation level on the same day. Rather, the US hits 100% on the day we hit 80%. But the point is made. By April 30th, the worst has happened. The only reason it didn't happen, so the public believes and the government is determined to tell them, is because of lockdown. We've long pointed out that lockdown has had zero effect, not changing the trajectory of the virus one iota, see chart updates, but no matter. The first thing we should address is that Ferguson did actually specify another clue in his verbose, say nothing useful explanation as to his model. Infection was assumed to be seeded in each country at an exponentially growing rate with a doubling time of 5 days, from early January 2020, with the rate of seeding being calibrated to give local epidemics which reproduced the observed cumulative number of deaths in GB or the US seen by 14th March 2020. Sometimes it's good when things slip past our attention. I would actually have given Ferguson credit for accurately using the apparent growth rate to foster his exponential meme, except there I also have to be careful because his chart is not exponential. His image, ICCRT page 7, with our coloured annotations, is shown here. It is not exponential. It is a variant of normal, log-normal, logistic, the classic humped curve being distinctive. Ferguson can rightly point out that he seeded his model with an exponential growth rate, but the eventual curve was not exponential. It doesn't change the fraudulent nature of his figures and report, but it means we must be careful as to stating the precise nature of his fraud. It was not misstating or misusing the exponential term. He may have been happy that others did so, but that is not a crime. Everyone who did promote the exponential meme as anything lasting for more than a few days did promote a fraudulent claim, massively distorting the reality of both the theoretical and actual virus propagation. Now we deal with the second issue, that doubling in 5 days. It generates a growth factor of 1.15, not 1.29 or 1.26 as we used previously, and is therefore half the rate, 0.15 increase versus 0.29. The reduced rate has the UK reach 81% infected, the ICCRT figure, on 28th May, the US on 9th of June. Same chart if the claim is that the virus climbs exponentially onwards at the initial rate. My problem with this is that it clearly bears little or no relation to the actual curves. It does comply with from initial numbers to March 14 numbers, which is what he is saying he did, but it is a fatuous exercise. The goal is to fit the model to the data. I hardly regard that as a fit. The US likewise. About the only relation between the green 1.14 line and the blue US data is that they're on the same page. Any fit is spurious at best. It niggles, but at least our original exponentials really did fit the curve latterly, even if we were going to debunk the whole thing eventually. This is like not even bothering to show up for the match. No matter, because we're going to briefly touch on the model, or lack thereof, and then cut to the critical output of the model. The model. We modified an individual-based simulation model developed to support pandemic influenza planning, notes 5 and 6, to explore scenarios for Covid-19 and GB. The basic structure of the model remains the previous primary and abbreviated, etc., 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 etc. Basically, there's more like this, but the key paragraph is, as already noted, infection was assumed to be seeded in each country at an exponentially growing rate with a doubling time of 5 days from early January 2020, with the rate of seeding being calibrated to give local epidemics which reproduce the observed cumulative number of deaths in GB or the US seen by 14th March 2020. That is the entirety of Ferguson's model as declared in Report 9, the publication whose premise presumably fueled the 80%, 53 million, 1% deaths, 530,000 deaths of the March 3rd press conference. It declared 81% infected, 510,000 UK deaths, 2.2 million US deaths. Its entire justification is, we had a model, we seeded it with a number, the output was as noted above. The only reasonable measure is intervention, the only truly effective measure is massive intervention to prevent overwhelm of the hospital system until a vaccine becomes available. In short, as we already know, Covid-19 is a massive threat, 530,000 Britons will die without intervention, you'd better get everybody into their homes and wait for the vaccine. Before accepting that and instigating that policy, a massively destructive policy to freedom, to democracy, to livelihoods, to our economy, did the government take rigorous measures to ensure that the proposed threat was accurately stated, and that the measures proposed were the only measures that could reasonably be taken to mitigate that threat? The simple answer to one is that they appear to have made no serious attempt to question the narrative. How could they have? The model is undefined and neither its principles nor its workings established. Subsequent attempts by developers to analyse the supposed model have found it to be weak and flawed. Completed and mature contagions were available to the government which massively contradicted the model. In regard to two reasonable alternatives, the government ignored that South Korea has already defeated the virus without lockdown, that Hubei had experienced a massive relatively contagion by comparison to its neighbouring provinces which benefited from a blockade, that South Korea achieved deaths 11 times lower than Hubei, indicating that far from getting off lightly, Hubei experienced a fully developed contagion, that death rates showed that the virus was a significant threat only to older members of society and those with contrary indicators already vulnerable, that an alternative strategy would have been simple: protect the elderly and vulnerable, everyone else get on with their lives. Thus the government implemented its strategy without the least qualms as to the validity of the report, without the least consideration of reasonable alternatives to lockdown. If the government claims otherwise, then we will happily consider their claims. But the availability of the evidence that shows they could have easily challenged and defeated the premise of Report 9 shows that either the government was incompetent and not fit to govern, or they were negligent and not fit to govern, or they were complicit and not fit to govern. Whichever is accurate, they are and were not fit to govern. We will stay focused on the initial decision and the grounds for that decision being Report 9. Ferguson has a model, unspecified, with principles unspecified, and with an input variable, 1.15 exponential factor, and an output, this chart. We may not know the workings, but we can tell from the output it's not exponential, but it's normal or closely related to such. How can we test the extent to which this chart is normal or related to such? Well, by making it transparent, we can try creating a couple of obvious candidates and overlaying the chart to see how well they fit. We have two reference points on each of the x and y axes, several in fact, so if they line up, we know that what we've drawn and what ICCRT are displaying are in sync, 0 and 20, and March 20 and October 20. Here's one we prepared earlier, and the spare image we've been showing you. Shift the spare so that the dates and y-axis figures line up, and that's our comparison. This is for a test of normal distributions. As you can see, it's a good fit and there's an interesting confirmation of the validity of the test. Notice that it's deaths per day on the y-axis, linear, and it's per 100,000 population. The UK is 66 million or 66.25 based on 53 divided by 0.8 from the 53 million infected at 80% infection rate. That's 660 100,000 units. So to find out how many deaths total per 100,000, we divide by 660 or 662.5. It's not going to be material. That's 769.81, which we then use as our scaling factor. As a probability chart, the area under the normal distribution is 1. We multiply the normal distribution probability by 769.81, and now the cases under the curve add up to not 1, but 769.81, the threatened 510,000 deaths in per 100k population terms. Notice this is similar to our per 100 million normalization, so Ferguson was proposing 769,810 deaths per 100 million, which you can see is basically 510,000 times 100 over 66.25. No lockdown Korea 496 deaths normalised, 496, versus a threatened 769, 810. And Korea was over by the time of Ferguson's report, let alone lockdown. Sweden, massively punished with deaths going sideways, that is not the virus, and yet it's still only 32,244 deaths normalised, not 769,810. Brazil, accused of being reckless for its no lockdown policies, and it's 5,524 deaths normalised, not 769,810. The truly disturbing thing about this crisis is that the public don't care. They don't want to hear that the government lied. They don't want to consider that it's been a lie from the very beginning. They are determined that if there's a threat, they must be protected. The virus exists, that's enough for them. Just tell us how to be safe. The true lesson of this crisis is not that the government lied, but that the government is always free to lie, and the bigger the lie, the better. I recognise this after watching JFK. The government doesn't need to get it perfect, it just needs the public to believe them for the few days necessary for the government to implement their policy, after which people noticing the flaws are irrelevant, because we have no power. Is it just me, or does every generation get a time to take advantage of this generation event? JFK 1963, something maybe in 1980, 9/11 in 2001 and WMD 2003, Covid-19 2020. Whence my position that while I will continue to accumulate the analysis and facts, we have already lost, because that is the nature of democracy, with an elite ruling a fearful or indifferent people. If we want to win, then we have to change the game entirely, eradicate the sham that is democracy, and replace it with a system that embraces truth, fairness, and freedom. How can any human being not ultimately wish for that? But we'll continue with our analysis and point out just how powerful this conclusion is. It's not merely a matter of saying, hey, it looks normal, look at that, it fits. The claimed deaths figure is a fixed value, and we've made it a requirement of our fit by saying that's how many must be under the curve. That's a fixed value. Now we can adjust the mean left-right by setting it to days from January 11th, as it happens to be in our spreadsheet, but it's whatever date is the peak of Ferguson's chart. We also have another fixed value, the point where Ferguson's chart peaks, so our chart must be aligned left-right to agree with that peak. That's easy, we set the mean to June 13th, 155 days after the start of our chart data, January 11th. Now we have only one parameter left in our normal distribution, and then it is completely defined. And that has to fix two things, height and width, or spread or variance. Imagine a picture of a B757 and a picture of your house. No matter how you scale the picture of the B757, it won't look like your house unless you live in an airliner. Indeed, it doesn't matter how much you scale or stretch an image of a B757, this B757 about to hit and explode in the Pentagon still looks like a patch of smoke superimposed on a clean background, mine at left. So we have one parameter left, the standard deviation, and if we set it wide, the curve drops. If we set it narrow, the curve rises. There is only one value of the standard deviation where the test curve matches the height of the Ferguson curve, and we have no control over the width of the chart that Excel decides is normal. So if the width fits, it is only because that is exactly the same model that Ferguson used, because regardless of its workings, it came up with the same result that a normal distribution does. As you can see, the widths spread of both curves are incredibly good fits, so normal is a perfectly legitimate distribution to use and readily available in Excel, which is handy. It's not, however, an official epidemiology curve. It is a probability distribution, not a virus growth or population growth model, yet it cannot fit so well without some reasonable cause or underlying principle. There is a closely related curve, the logistic curve, which is an official population curve, and its fit is shown here. Again, pretty damn good, I'd say. The logistic curve is an official chart for modelling population growth, and the wiki article on the same has a Covid-19 reference cited. So here's an official epidemic curve That's again a pretty good fit. Puffy ankles a pound out at the waist, no one except a troll is going to quibble that ICCRT and logistic curves are a good fit. The consequence is that however many staff Ferguson employed, however much computing power he deployed, he could have portrayed the same result with an Excel spreadsheet. Notice I say portrayed. Why he believes that the figures 510,000 June the 13th and 14-day standard deviation normal are a good fit are a different matter. We will touch on that in a moment. However, what this demonstrates is that the sophistication of his model is no more than a normal distribution or logistic curve, pretty basic, about as basic as it gets in fact. What about a last candidate, log normal? Well, you can see this time that the black UK curve pretty much obscures the pink UK curve, so that really is a log normal curve. I couldn't quite find a magic combination of numbers for the US curve, but it's so close that again it's plenty good enough and not exponential. So that's the model that created this crisis, the response to a modest but real threat that was turned into a massive threat and used to take down democracy at a huge cost in fear generated, freedom revoked and financial loss of earnings from people who don't have a magic parent government to pay their bills. It doesn't matter how much funny money the government secures to tide it over, it's accumulating that debt, and there's only one class of citizen that is a net contributor to the government's finances: the private sector taxpayer. Forget the wealthy, they're far too smart to pay their share. Forget the welfare and public sector workers. Just your average Joe working, now not working, and about to pay off the mother of all college loans from the school of being scammed. And we've just shown that the model used was no more sophisticated in practice than a simple normal, log normal or logistic curve, which leaves the question, where did that figure of 510,000 deaths come from? The article doesn't say. The real-world data massively contradicts it. If it's not based on the real world, then it is fiction, pure and simple, utterly fictional, made up, invented. Now, why would a scientist funded by the Gates Foundation make up an absurd figure exaggerating a real but modest risk and turning it into a massive threat, only responding to massive intervention and vaccine?
It is fair to say things won't go back to truly normal until we have a vaccine that we've gotten out to basically the entire world. It won't go back to truly normal until we have a vaccine that we've gotten out to basically the entire world. It won't go back to truly normal until we have a vaccine.
Forget normal life, forget the normal distribution. We're going to scare you with an invented figure and an utterly fraudulent exponential meme so you stay at home and wait for the vaccine. With nothing better to do, let's just ram home the extent to which the public and pundits have managed to ignore even the official pronouncements that the virus is normal. That Ferguson chose to present his figures as normal shows that he knows the virus is a normal, logistic, log-normal propagation. That the NHS or government chose these normal charts shows they know perfectly well it's a normal distribution, whether normal, logistic or log-normal. That Hubei showed normal distributions in cases and deaths is a clue that virus propagation is a normal process, whether logistic normal or log-normal. That Korea's chart is so perfectly normal and even more perfectly log-normal that it's a work of art reinforces that this was the only model of virus propagation that should be publicized and considered. Think about that. How many times have you seen articles emphasizing that Covid-19 follows a normal distribution or a log-normal distribution or a logistic curve? And how many articles have you seen that emphasize the threat of the exponential virus growth? Can so many people be truly that ignorant? Scholars, pundits, and influence. If they're ignorant, they're culpable by dint of irresponsibility, promoting a massively damaging meme without due cause and without the knowledge to inform people properly. If they're not ignorant, then it becomes criminal culpability, a determined effort to promote a false meme for the purpose of increasing the perception of threat and so increasing the degree of fear and increasing the degree of compliance with the government's agenda. Right from the start we said Hubei, 59.17 million people, UK 66 million people, add 10%, technically multiply by 66 over 59.17. Hubei deaths 3085, UK deaths 3441. That's it. That UK deaths are up to 35,704, 10 times, doesn't change the validity of the estimate. That would have been 1 times Hubei. The question is, why are we at 10 times Hubei? China lied. No, Hubei is dead center in the pack of world countries' reported figures at 2 death days, COVID deaths divided by normal deaths per day. The Far East does 10 times better than Hubei, yet the UK is doing 10 times worse. Do you think the government ever reached out to find out why? Has the media highlighted the scandalous failure of the UK versus Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, Taiwan, etc., let alone Vietnam, which had a death but then withdrew it? And we ourselves are normal, or were until the virus ceased to act like a virus, with cases just heading off sideways. There is a legitimate cultural issue in our figures versus the Far East. The Far East is probably a bit more fatalistic, but it is also a lot less embroiled in 2 other factors: Western blame and Western game playing. In a society where it's illegal to die, someone must be to blame, and that's an easy place to stoke emotions. Just have people die. And how about other EU nations like Greece with excellent results? By now you'll have seen these graphics. The virus doesn't play games, it just does what it does. For countries to be hit more severely according to their closeness to the US, New York, EU, Brussels and UK power centres, that's not the virus. So way back when, by March 3rd even, but certainly by March 15th, the last day World Health Organization reported regional figures for China, it was known that it wasn't exponential, 3085 deaths for 59 million people. And even the source of the toxic 53 million infected, 530,000 deaths, never said it was entirely exponential, just seeded exponential. Whoever uses the exponential meme is either ignorant or spreading fear deliberately, or maybe both. For our purposes, since Ferguson has displayed that he believed in a normal family, humped normal, log normal logistic distribution, he can no longer claim that it would simply keep going straight till it curls over. We do know someone who did claim exactly that.
That curve would never bend until you had the majority of the people infected.
Well, there's fraud, pure and simple. Gates lies or misrepresents the facts 26 times in the first 2 minutes and 30 seconds of his Fox News April the 5th interview. But we're focused on that original threat. Now Ferguson's in a pickle because his magic model that developers are wasting their time with generated a very scary figure. For Ferguson, as it turns out, we don't need these charts. For anyone claiming it's exponential, this is what they're claiming. We defeat that claim by showing charts of no lockdown countries, Sweden, Brazil to name 2, and charts which curled over before lockdown, specifically which demonstrated normal virus behaviour. Ferguson put forward his normal but 510,000 death chart. He now has to get the virus trajectory to 53 million infected, which we need to translate into cases. Of course, these days a case is anything from something that will lead to death, to being hospitalized, to having symptoms, to being tested, or even being breadfruit. Tanzanian president, as I recall. In the early days before testing, there was a plausible and practical distinction. If you were ill enough to require hospitalization, that's a case. Now it's all but meaningless. And we're only reducing infection to cases to be fair, and why would we do that? But 50% asymptomatic and 25% of symptomatic requiring hospitalization would be a very fair number. So that would be 50% of 53 million symptomatic for a quarter of those requiring hospitalization, which is definitely a case of needing assistance or a proper case. That's 27 million and a quarter of that close enough. Since the percentages are entirely up in the air, quibbling over decimal places would be absurd. Call it 6.5 million needing hospital treatment under Ferguson's scenario. And do you think that the public heard, oh, that's not 53 million, it's only 6.5 million, barely 10% of that? No, I'm sure they heard 53 million as, oh my God, that's me, my family, we're all going to hospital, oh my God, we'll likely die. As I have no doubt the people making those announcements were fully aware. As it happens, we can also do a sanity check appropriate in these times. Ferguson includes this chart showing do nothing at 280 critical care beds per 100,000 population. Multiply by 660, 66 million divided by 100k, and we get 184,800 critical care beds required. From this chart we see the percentages that in theory require hospitalization if symptomatic and require critical care if hospitalized. From that table we can work back to the implied infected. To need a critical bed you need to be symptomatic and needing hospital, and within hospital needing critical care, so multiply those two to get symptomatic critical care required by age. From e.g. Diamond Princess, asymptomatic is around 50%, so of all infected only symptomatic risk going to hospital, so we need to dilute further by multiplying that by 50%. There's no reason to think that any particular age is more likely to be infected, which is a transmission issue, so we take the average of those age ranges. Yes, it's bound to be wrong, but we're working out sanity checks. Are they reasonable figures? At 2% infected needing 184,800 beds, total implied infected are 9.2 million, not 53 million, a surprising differential. Putting absurd figures in doesn't help much. Only 10% asymptomatic is absurd, but at least it boosts infected to 46 million. Focusing on old people drops it to 21 million. Focusing on 30 to 69 gets it to 55 million. Now I finally realised that I used only the peak number, not the area under the curve. But unlike cases, beds are required for weeks on end, so it isn't a simple translation. Nevertheless, that does give us an indication that we have a lower bound model to work with, which may need to be about 5 times higher. We can also use this to calculate implied cases if we decide what a case is. These days it includes asymptomatic, but let's say in the early days it was symptomatic. Easy enough, don't bother including the asymptomatic, so it's critical implies case is critical, symptomatic equals 184,800 divided by 4%. Letting the spreadsheet do the work, it's 4,595,135. Okay, we had 6.5 million, we can go with 4.5 million. And bearing in mind that our implied infected was 9.5 million, not 53 million, due to peak, not overall bed requirements, we can see that a candidate figure for say 5 times 4.5 million cases is 22.5 million. All these figures are so up in the air, but we're just trying to be fair, working from Ferguson's model and eventually contrasting it with the real world. So we've got cases in the early days when it meant something other than infected of between say 5 million and 20 million as Ferguson threat scenario. The only place in the world coming close to that is out of sight New York City at over 2 million normalized cases. But hey, that's still lower than 4.5 million or 20 million, and that's thanks to lockdown. Oh dear. Lockdown was a genius meme to explain why a massively exaggerated figure never occurred. But thanks to your obedience, the much lower and normal one did, as it was doing anyway, and it's still 122 times worse in the UK than in the Far East, and no one in the media has noticed. Moving on, Professor Ferguson has declared a normal model, declared cases in a range 5 million to 20 million. Now we get to see what that looks like as a normal day cases and a normal total cases chart, and then the fun stuff, comparing that scenario with reality. Except that Chris Whitty, UK CMO, spoke of 1% deaths from infected, whereas the overall China cases death ratio was 4.6%. So we can divide 53 million by 4.6, the increase in case death ratio to infected death ratio, to get 11.5 million. We've yet to inhabit the bizarre world of UK death rates, so let's go with that. Notice that 11.5 million is comfortably in our range from 5 million to 20 million, using other methods to get a sanity check figure, so let's roll with that. We'll generate a chart based on 11.5 million UK cases versus 53 million infected, and see how realistic that looks. So here's the official prognosis of the Imperial College COVID-19 response team, aka Ferguson. What's the first thing you notice? Other than that we're 47 times lower than the worst case, lockdown. On 14th March, which informed his choice of data for his model, we have over 1,000 cases, 1144. His official prognosis is that we won't get 1,000 cases until 20th of April, 1127 cases. What? Does it seem to you that if his model is supposed to be the authoritative prediction of the worst case future, that it should at least reflect the present state accurately. It's like there's a disconnect, like it really doesn't matter what the reality is, just so long as he gets his paper out, and frankly I suspect that's not far from the truth. Now it's my last chance to check before switching to the world data spreadsheet, so does my normal cases distribution match the Ferguson deaths distribution, since deaths are a nominal percent of cases? And it does. Fine. We've established the utterly normal nature of Ferguson's threat, 510,000 deaths, report 9. We've shown that there's nothing exponential in the overall virus propagation. We've established a working case figure for this threat, and we've got a normal distribution chart for cases in total. At which point it is time for that moment of humour as the NCIS team wrap up the show before starting again tomorrow. But our novel coronavirus investigation service is wiped, knackered or kaput. So it's good night from me, and it's good night from Mim. Tune in to part 3 and we'll finally get to do a world tour and see just how little Ferguson's threat reflected reality. We already knew that, but there's 400 million people in the US, UK and Canada still unaware of that, so we'll keep going. And if Bill Gates is watching, or anyone that knows him, let him know that I'd happily produce an Excel chart for him for far less than 40 million. Still, I guess he got his money's worth. We're in lockdown, waiting for the vaccine. I'm still Andrew Mather, a 60-year-old Brit, mathematician, financier, technologist, husband, biker, pilot, healer, whatever. Feel free to get in touch, andrew@peerlessreads.com or andrew@amather.com. Either should get to me.